Thank you. I certainly want to thank the panel for their excellent testimony. The chair now recognizes himself for a round of questions for 5 minutes. And I want to address my first question to the entire panel, and each one of you can take a few seconds to answer the questions as you will. Most of you have testified this morning that the FTC has not done enough to address consumer credit issues over the past years, particularly over the last 8 years. And let me just ask each one of you, do you believe that this has occurred because of lack of action that's either political or structural in nature? In other words, do you believe the Commission has failed to act because of a simple lack of will or because of some underlying obstacles, such as the lack of statutory authority, the lack of resources, burdensome procedures, or all of the above? I mean, what do you, if you could explain to me and your answers, why you believe the FTC has failed to act? Mr. Attorney?
Well, we can go in the same order, Congressman. I think it is clear that the leadership of the Federal Trade Commission at the very highest level in the last 8 years, the very highest level, shared the deregulatory philosophy which was predominant at the time. And the philosophy was clearly stated to state attorneys general on a regular basis that you are officious intermeddlers, you are denying credit to people who need it, you are applying the wrong standards, that we should let the marketplace prevail and it will be a self-regulatory procedure. And although time and again attorneys general would expressly predict, if it turned out conservatively, 1 million home foreclosures, they were characterized as alarmist, not necessarily by the Federal Trade Commission, but by the tone of the times and by the interest groups that surrounded the commission. So the commission at the top reflected the reality. I also make another smaller point, that our past 2 presidents have consisted in naming people to the commissioners with an antitrust background, not a consumer protection background. And that's a bipartisan characterization of our past 3 presidents, actually. And that it would be a really good idea if the Federal Trade Commission had someone on the commission who had a consumer protection background, and secondly, actually had worked with the states and did not come from a large law firm or from the Hill. And I don't mean that personal characterization, but I really do believe that the FTC is lacking that kind of background and experience at the very highest level.
Does the other panel want to weigh in on this?
I do. I'd like to say that in the past 12 years, it's been primarily a political or lack of willpower issue. But going forward, it's more likely to have something to do with the structural issues. I mean, I think that there are structural problems, but even if 12 years ago we had cleared out all those structural problems, they still wouldn't have done anything. Going forward, I think they're going to try and do some things now, and it's going to be harder for them to do it than it should be because of the structural barriers, and it would probably help if we cleared some of those out. But even still, I think we're still talking about tinkering with things. We're not talking about the magnitude of change that needs to happen in order to help facilitate more efficient and effective commerce.
I would concur with my fellow panelists. I mean, I think a lot of it was ideological. I think there was this notion that self-regulation would work and the FTC should not interfere in the commerce of credit. So I think that's part of it, without a doubt. And in part, that's why a lot of consumer advocates did not engage with the FTC, and the AGs didn't engage with the FTC, because we feared that the work we did would actually be undercut by by their philosophy. I do think that resources are a significant problem there. They have an awful lot of jurisdiction. They have very limited resources. They have very little rulemaking. And I also agree that if they had that authority over the last decade, nothing would have changed. But I think going forward, we have some opportunity to do something.
Yeah, Mr. Benson, I have 30 seconds, so please.
Yes. We felt that through those cases that they have done things about, that's affected close over 10,000 people, and when they pick on an entity in an industry, that has helped clear up everyone that's tied to that industry. So it's not just that entity that's been affected, it's everyone in that environment that gets cleaned up pretty quick. So we think they have been pretty effective. When they've picked on one entity, it goes through to the whole industry doing the same things. So we think so far they have been effective.
Thank you very much. The chair now recognizes the ranking member, Mr. Radonovich, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Benson, welcome to the subcommittee. I appreciate your testimony. I want to start off with you on a couple of questions. Do you believe the FTC needs APA procedures in order to be effective, or can it use the existing authority that it has to effectively regulate the industry?
We believe that it can use its existing authority that it has.
Let me ask you, how can regulation be used to reduce fraud without adding unnecessary compliance costs that are inevitably passed on to the consumer?
Well, most of our members through AFSA are state regulated, so we are controlled by that. We are in favor of disclosure with all our members, so we work with those people. So we believe with fuller disclosure and with obviously the regulations we have the state, we believe that fraud will come out, as long as it's monitored.
I was looking at the new sample disclosure form by the FTC, which I thought was kind of interesting. Can you tell me your opinion of it? It seems it's easy to read. Have you seen it?
So no, we haven't seen it.
Okay. My first glance at it is something that looks kind of positive. I mean, I was curious to know what your thoughts would be on it. Sorry?
Yeah, as I said earlier, our view is the more disclosure and the simpler it gets,
The better.
a lot better it is.
Okay. One last question. Are the FTC's proposed disclosure simplification forms for mortgage? I think you've already answered that one. Thank you, Mr. Benson. I appreciate that. Mr. Reingold, can I ask you, you testified that the FTC, that had the FTC the will to actively engage in oversight, much of the current credit crisis could have been avoided. But, we're talking about increasing authority through the APA, and we're discussing that additional authority. Isn't that kind of a duplicative, contrary statement? Or
I don't think so. I actually think, there's two things happening here. I think I think to be fair, the FTC was not the controlling regulatory agency here. The OCC
Right.
and the OTS really failed, and they had a lot of things that they could have done to prevent the disaster that we have today. I think the OCC, through its enforcement powers, if they in fact had been effective enforcers, and using those decisions, I think the perfect example of what a strong enforcement agency can do is what the Massachusetts AG did in the Fremont case, where they brought a case against a mortgage company who was engaged in unfair practices, where they were making loans that people could not afford. And using the unfairness authority, that court declared that these practices, A, B, C, and D, making a loan at a teaser rate that explodes and people can't afford it is unfair. Making a loan to people over 50% of their gross income is per se unfair. If the FTC would have taken some of those actions, even in their Fairbanks case, there was an opportunity to declare certain practices that the service industry does as unfair. It could have had a real impact on the type of practices that exist throughout the mortgage industry.
using that example, where was the problem then? Was it in the lack of was it in the application of Magnuson Moss, or was it?
Well, no, I'm talking about their enforcement power. I
Okay.
mean, there's a difference between rulemaking. I mean, there are a couple of ways that they can set the law.
Mm-hmm.
By bringing in, if the FTC brings in action and gets a court order that declares as part of their court-agreed order that this practice is unfair, that will have a pretty large impact in terms of the rest of the industry, because it will send a clear signal that this is an unfair practice and hopefully would stop it. That's one way they can do it, through their court enforcement procedures.
Mm-hmm.
I think the easier thing they could have done, if they in fact had normal, everyday, regular authority to make rulemaking, is they could have done that without having to bring court cases. And the fact is, as someone who's been a veteran of dealing with a lot of the rulemaking that's done through all sorts of regulatory agencies, industry and consumer groups have ample opportunity through the APA procedure to get their voices heard and influence that process. And the notion that they need 6 to 8 years with this lengthy excuse me, but cockamamie system of developing a way of rulemaking, really, it's counterproductive and useless. And anything that they could do with the current system that we have in place, if it takes 6 to 8 years, by the time you get a decision, the problems out there would have evolved to something completely different.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Reingold. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. Chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Ohio, Ms. Sutton, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We've heard repeatedly here today about some of the shortcomings of what we're trying to accomplish in the process that we now exist. A couple of those, of course, revolve around the fact that the FTC, we hear over and over again, doesn't have the authority over banks that it has over other entities. And we also hear about the rulemaking process being too cumbersome. But I guess one of the questions for this committee and for the Congress and for all of us here is, if the FTC had rulemaking authority that was more streamlined, the APA rulemaking authority, and they had greater authority over the banks, and they had resources to do the job, is it better for the FTC to be the agency that deals with this, or some of you have suggested there should be a new entity that do so? If you could just answer those questions for me, I'd appreciate your opinion.
I guess I would say, Congresswoman, I'm, like many of us, we're studying the proposal by Professor Warren. It's been codified in the so-called Durbin-Delahunt bill. I'm not taking position on it yet, but it has a lot to do it. But if I may, to go back to your earlier point about payday lending and remind the song, if you can't be with the one you love, love the one you're with. We have enough authority now between the states and the trial lawyers and the legislatures and the Federal Trade Commission. If we just want to do something and focus on the problems such as payday, take the resources we have, set a national strategic goal, and just go do it. And my concern about discussion of the larger institution is that while we play that huge congressional effort that goes on for so long, that we've got millions of people suffering every day, and we should do something right now.
You know, I believe that the way you regulate it is, and I'm I think the only business person here, is you've got to have some skin in the game. You've got to have some money in the game. So if you're going to securitize, you've got to have someone's got to hold a portion of the securitization on the books. If you're going to have loans out there, you've got to have the risk factor, that you shouldn't be able to go and draw on someone's bank account. You should be able to analyze the person's credit, make the loan that they can afford over time, payments over time, equal payments. That would solve the problem, rather than the risk factor. When you've got nothing at risk, the issues come out.
If I could, I think that a new agency is the way to go. That's my honest opinion. The second choice would be the Federal Trade Commission. I don't think you should give it to the Federal Reserve Board. They've demonstrated that they're bankers at their heart and soul, and they had the authority to pass they have extensive authority under the 1994 Homeownership and Equity Protection Act. You passed that statute and gave them all the power that they needed, and they did nothing. The Federal Reserve Board could have stopped this easily with their rulemaking authority under HOPA, and they didn't do anything. So what's to think that that's going to change now? And what's more, with the Federal Reserve Board, they have so much political autonomy. I mean, it's so hard to exercise oversight over them because of their justified and needed monetary policy independence. I just don't think that it's a good political entity that's going to be at the beck and call of Congress and will be responsive to the people. It's time for a new consumer finance regulator that deals with these types of questions. And if you can't get that passed, the Federal Trade Commission is the next best choice. But the problem is that the FTC has a lot of other important stuff to do. It needs to be out there on the antitrust watchdog beat. It needs to be dealing with privacy issues, telemarketing issues, all very important issues, and very different than the consumer finance problems that we're talking about now. If this is ever going to happen, it's now. And if you don't do it now, it'll never happen, and we'll continue to suffer from these systemic problems for the next 50 to 100 years.
I agree.
Is that an I agree, Mr. Reingold?
That would be an I absolutely agree.
Okay, thank you, and I yield back.
The chair thanks the witnesses. We don't intend to go into a second round of questions. I think that we have been well served by both panels today. And the chair really, again, we are most grateful to this panel for the extensive use of your time. And we want to commend you and on your patience with us as we through this particular issue. I just want to note that all witnesses should be prepared to receive and answer written questions from members of this subcommittee. And with that, thank you very much. And
Mr. Chairman, sorry, could I ask that my complete statement be included in the record?
So ordered,
Thank
without objection. And I would like to request unanimous consent to enter into the record a statement from the organization Public Citizen without objection, so ordered. This subcommittee now stands adjourned.